The 1031 exchange. Maybe you've heard of it, maybe you want to know more. Either way, I've got you. Today, I'm going to break it down for you. I'm going to teach you everything there is to know about 1031 exchanges and IRS 1031 exchange rules. If you're new to 1031 exchanges, let's start from the very top. What is a 1031 exchange? How does it work? And what are the benefits? A 1031 exchange, or a like-kind exchange, is a method of exchanging investment properties that allows you to defer capital gains tax. Referred to by its namesake, IRS Code Section 1031, the bill was passed in 1921 to encourage active reinvestment by giving investors the ability to avoid taxation of ongoing investment property. The primary benefit of a 1031 exchange is obvious tax deferment. With a 1031 exchange, you can defer taxes on the investment properties you own or manage indefinitely until you sell, exchanging from one property to another. When you consider what this allows you to do, it opens up a whole section of added benefits, such as these three things. First, exchange for market conditions. For example, let's say you're worried about another bubble. You can take some of your Class C properties and exchange them for more stable Class A, helping you weather the storm. In the same way a stock investor might shift investments from live stocks to the S&P. With a 1031 exchange, you're able to move your investment capital around in a way that will minimize your risk. Second, exchange to minimize upkeep. Also, similarly, you could shift some of your Class C or D properties to lower maintenance Class A or B properties if the upkeep is just too much. And third, exchange to take advantage of a developing area. You could shift your properties from one location to a more desirable or promising location in effort to position your properties for greater future returns. And the great part is that there is no limit on how often or how many exchanges you can do. You can continue to shift your investment capital around to maximize returns and create your ideal portfolio. Let me explain the 1031 exchange rules. A 1031 exchange is pretty straightforward. If you own or manage investment or business property, you can exchange it with a like-kind property to defer capital gains tax, if you follow the rules. Now, it's important to understand 1031 exchange rules and requirements before doing one on any property you manage or own. The rules are as follows: needs to be like-kind property, must be the same taxpayer, needs to be investment or business property, property must be equal or greater value, and must follow the 1031 exchange timeline. These are the same 1031 exchange rules for California, Texas, New York, or any of the 50 states you might manage your own properties. So no matter where you are, these are important to know. Each one of these could use some explanation, so I'll break them down real quick. So first, it needs to be like-kind property. So to do a 1031 exchange, the new property you're purchasing needs to be like-kind the property you're selling. According to IRS.gov website, a like-kind property must be of the same nature or character, even if they differ in grade or quality. That's pretty vague, but the rules are pretty generous. Both properties must be used for the same purpose, which essentially means that you can make a case that any two investment or business properties are like-kind. You can even relinquish one property in exchange for two properties in some cases. For example, a rental in exchange for two commercial properties. Second rule, needs to be the same taxpayer. This might be obvious, but it's worth noting. In a 1031 exchange, both the property being sold or exchanged and the property being bought needs to be purchased by the same party. If the names on the sale property and the exchange property are different, it won't be accepted. Third rule, it needs to be an investment or business property. There was previously a loophole that allowed the use of personal property in some cases, but due to recent changes with the 1031 exchange law, that is no longer the case. So according to the IRS, Section 1031 now applies only to exchanges of real property and not exchanges of personal or intangible property. Keep in mind that this goes both ways. You can't sell a personal residence to purchase investment property or new warehouse or building for your business, and you can't sell investment property or business property to purchase personal property. The fourth rule, the property must be equal or greater value. This one isn't a full requirement, but it will eat at your tax deferment and essentially nullify the whole purpose of the exchange. So to qualify for 100% tax deferment, the net market value of the property you're purchasing has to be equal or greater value than the one you're selling. Here's an example of an exchange that would qualify for 100% deferment. The property you're selling is $750,000, and then the profit you're purchasing is $810,000. And then here's an example of one that wouldn't work. The property you're selling is $615,000, and the property you're purchasing is $510,000. So in that second example, the one you're buying is less than the one you're selling, so it wouldn't apply. It's important to note that this applies to the mortgage as well. Both the value of the property and the mortgage on the property you're looking to purchase must be equal or greater than the value and the mortgage on the property you're selling. So for example, for the 100% 100% tax deferment, the property you're selling could be $750,000 value and your mortgage is $500,000. And then the property you're purchasing is $810,000 and the mortgage is going to be $650,000. So the value of the property you're purchasing and the mortgage is higher than the value and mortgage of the one you're selling. Now here's where it wouldn't apply. Let's say the value of the house you're selling is $750,000 and the mortgage is $500,000. And the property you're purchasing is greater than the value, $810,000, but the mortgage is less, $450,000. So even though the value of the house is more, the mortgage is less, so it wouldn't be 100% tax deferment. I'll touch on this in the next rule, but you can qualify for an exchange even if the value or mortgage on the new property is less than the original for sale property. And a helpful note, fees such as broker and inspection fees apply here, so make sure you include them all in your calculation for the most accurate estimate. So then there's this thing called boot. This is what happens when the value of the property that you're buying is less than the one that you're selling. You pay capital gain tax immediately at purchase on the boot amount. So for example, the property you're selling is $1.25 million and the property you're buying is $1.1 million. So the one you're buying is less than the one you're selling. The boot would be $150,000. So you pay capital gains on the $150,000, but capital gains are deferred on that $1.1 million of the purchase value. Rule number 5 is it must follow the 1031 exchange timeline. So one of the more confusing aspects of the whole process is the 1031 exchange time. So let me make it crystal clear. From the moment you close on the for sale property, the timeline begins. That's day 1. From day 1, you have 45 days to choose 3 potential replacement properties. These must be qualifying like-kind exchange candidates. So keep in mind, you're not choosing one right now, you just need to have 3 candidates selected. So what if you change your mind? If you change your mind later and decide not to select one of your original 3 candidates, you'll incur capital gains tax and essentially nullify the major benefit of the exchange. So be careful about choosing these 3 candidates. There is one exception to this. It's called the 200% rule. If you can't decide between just 3, you are allowed to select additional candidates. The only 1031 exchange rule of this is the total value of those replacement candidates must not exceed 200% of the value of the original property which you sold. So now that you've selected your candidates, the final 135 days in the exchange timeline are reserved for finalizing the purchase of the new property. By the end of the 180-day window, the exchange should be completed to qualify for 100% tax deferment. So now you know the 5 rules, let's move on to who qualifies for a 1031 exchange. The qualifying parties are pretty all-inclusive. You can do a 1031 exchange if you're a property investor or simply own business property. And to be more specific, you can perform a 1031 exchange if you're an individual, a C Corp, an S Corp, a partnership, general or limited, LLC, trust, or any other tax-paying entity. Now let's go back and clarify what property qualifies for a like-kind exchange. Earlier we touched on the like-kind exchanges, however you might still be a bit unclear as to what exactly qualifies as a like-kind exchange. So let's dive into that a little deeper with some examples. Like-kind property is defined as a property of the same nature, character, or class. And note, the quality and grade don't matter with regards to like-kind property. For example, you can exchange a small office building for a small apartment complex, vacant land, or a larger office building. All of those would qualify as like-kind exchanges because they need only one of the same nature, character, or class. Now there's one major exception to this, particularly for property managers of overseas investors, is that properties outside the United States is never like-kind to US property, which only makes sense given that the 1031 is a US tax code. So now let's move on to the types of 1031 exchanges. There's actually 4 different kinds of 1031 exchanges: a deferred or delayed exchange, simultaneous exchange, reverse exchange, and construction or improvement exchange. Let's break down each one and go over some of the pros and cons. First is the deferred exchange. By far, this is the most common type of 1031 exchange and the one most are familiar with. In a deferred, or sometimes called delayed exchange, the time between the sale of your current property and the purchase of a new property are separate from one another. Once the sale closes, you have 180 days in total to hire a qualified intermediary to initiate the sale and hold the funds in a trust to be used to purchase the like-kind property, to select an exchange property, and to purchase the new property. The second kind is a simultaneous exchange. In a simultaneous exchange, the property you're selling or exchanging and the property you're buying close on the exact same day. As opposed to a deferred exchange, this one doesn't offer much flexibility and can be difficult to pull off. After all, even a small delay in this process on either side can throw everything off. There are 3 ways a simultaneous exchange can be performed. First, a qualified intermediary. Here, you can also hire a qualified intermediary to handle the whole process, taking some of the stress off your back. Here, a third party other than qualified intermediary manages the process. And third, you can use a deed swap. An exchange of deeds, essentially a trade, happens when the other party who is simultaneously purchasing your property and selling one of theirs. The third kind is a reverse exchange. In a reverse or forward exchange, things are flipped on their head. First, you purchase the new property, then you sell the old, often referred to as relinquished property. Keep in mind, to do a reverse exchange, all cash is required for the purchase of the new property. In this type of exchange, the deferred exchange, but the reverse, you have 180 days to sell the old relinquished property. If you don't, the exchange is canceled and you're due for the taxes. Between the purchase of the new property and the sale of the old one, that property is parked. Once the old property is sold, the proceeds are forwarded by an intermediary, typically through a trust, and the exchange is complete. The fourth kind is a construction exchange. In this final type of exchange, a construction or improvement exchange, you have the flexibility to perform improvements using the equity from the sale of the exchange property. The only caveat to that is there are a few 1031 exchange rules you need to follow. All of the equity from the sale must be spent on improvements or as a down payment during the purchase of the new property by the 180th day of the exchange process. You as a buyer must receive substantially the same property of that which you identified by the 45th day of the exchange process, and improvements must be completed before the title can be transferred over to you. There are some special cases to be aware of when it comes to doing a 1031 exchange. In most cases, they may not apply to you, however, it's worth making yourself aware of them in the rare case that it does apply. So 1031 exchanges on vacation homes. In the past, the law was more lenient in terms of what you could do with a vacation home via 1031 exchange. Since 2004, restrictions have been put in place. However, it is still possible to turn a vacation home into a rental, then 1031 exchange it. For example, let's say you have a summer home that you've stopped using, so you decide to transform it into a rental. There's no exact time periods, but as long as you've had tenants in the property for at least 6 months, preferably a year, a 1031 exchange is generally considered safe. The time with active tenants, not just up for rent, there should actually be tenants in the property, is key. So the longer the better. Okay, so what if you decide you'd like to convert one of your 1031 exchange properties to your primary residence? You can do it without incurring the wrath of your deferred capital gains tax, but there are caveats. First, in 2008, IRS rulings set forth a safe harbor rule that states you must meet these two rules within each of the first 2 years immediately following the exchange for it to maintain its classification as an investment property. First, the unit must be rented to another person for a fair rental for a minimum of 14 days. You cannot use the unit for personal use for greater of 14 days or 10% of the number of days during the said 12-month period that the unit was rented out. In other words, it's generally safest to rent out the property upon 1031 exchange for 2 years before converting it into your personal residence. In addition to this, if you have any plans of selling that primary residence within 5 years of the exchange, you won't be shielded by the primary residence capital gains tax break. So consider carefully what your plans are for the property, whether you plan on using it long term, at least beyond 5 years, or later exchanging it or not. Next is this thing called tenancy-in-common. Tenancy-in-common gives you the ability to invest and obtain fractional ownership in a much larger property with up to 35 total investors. This offers several benefits, including the ability to obtain a stake in a much larger investment property than you'd otherwise be able to obtain on your own, the ability to diversify your holdings, or consolidate those holdings. It's important to note that when using a tenancy-in-common, you have the same rights as a full owner. That means you can sell your portion of the property at any time, so long as you can be accredited by meeting certain financial requirements. So now on to how do you report a 1031 exchange on taxes. IRS Form 8824 is used to report a 1031 exchange on your taxes. Be sure to file it for the year the exchange occurred. Some of the information you're gonna need is dates when the property was identified and transferred, the value of the property received, property descriptions, any possible relationship between the two parties involved in the exchange, cash received or paid, and adjustable basis of like-kind property sold or relinquished. And last thing to talk about is 1031 exchanges and estate planning. One of the greatest long-term benefits of using 1031 exchanges and real estate investing is the ability to completely erase the deferred tax debt upon inheritance of the property. When a property is inherited through a 1031 exchange, meaning the property was acquired at some point in time through the use of a 1031 exchange, the value of the property is upgraded to fair market value and the tax debt is erased. But of course, make sure to consult an estate planner to make sure you're following the IRS 1031 exchange rules correctly and the right steps are put in place, as there are details that can invalidate this process. A 1031 exchange is a tool that should be used wisely. After all, you don't want to mess with the IRS. However, when utilized properly, it can elevate the performance of investment property and give incredible flexibility on multiple levels. Just make sure to consult with a qualified intermediary before the process if it's your first exchange to make sure you have all the right pieces in place. And a huge disclaimer, the materials and information I I've given you in this video are for informational purposes only and not for the purpose of providing tax or legal advice. You should contact your attorney and/or accountant to obtain advice with respect to any particular issue, question, or problem. All that being said, I hope that I was able to break down a 1031 exchange, all the requirements, all the rules, all the ways it could benefit, and if it did, then make sure to give this video a huge thumbs up and subscribe for more helpful tips and tricks as a property owner. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!